Couple
I
of
didn't
years.
bring my books in.
Well,
Good
I hadn't
afternoon,
either.
and good afternoon.
Oh, good afternoon. This is not Doug Holder. This is Paul Stone welcoming you to Poet, Writer to Writer. And this week we thought we'd turn the tables on Doug and actually interview him. So that's what this is about. This is Doug Holder, my guest. He's been basically your host for many years. And tonight we're going to talk to him about what it's like to be a poet.
Thank you, Paul.
Welcome
You're a
to the show.
novelist and a journalist.
Right, Doug wants to turn the tables and maybe ask me a few questions about being a novelist.
Okay.
So, to just start this right off at the very beginning, which is a good place
Yeah.
to start, at what age did you realize that you had a calling to write poetry?
What age? Well, I really didn't start, I'm 53, 54 next month, but I didn't really have, I didn't start publishing poetry till I was in my mid-30s. And then, but I mean, I was writing with the and formulating it into poems eventually, probably starting in my 20s.
And did-
But I mean, I don't think I knew I was going to be a writer. I think I had ideas about being a writer, in college and things like that, but nothing that I really seriously entertained, and didn't really start writing with an eye to that till probably I was in my 20s. That's when I started keeping journals and recording snippets of conversation. Eventually, all that material became fodder for my poetry.
Mm-hmm. But did you read poetry when you were young? Or younger?
Oddly enough, I read poetry, but much more fiction.
Mhm.
And I got a lot of stuff from fiction and newspapers, and I read extensively newspapers, New York Times, Boston Globe, fiction, literary history, things like that.
So when you're starting to write in the 30s, are you saying to yourself, I'm a poet? Or do you say to yourself, I'm somebody who does other things, but I feel like I should also be writing poetry? Or are you a poet?
Well, I by the time I was in my early 30s, the die was cast. I knew I was a poet, and I had a need to be. I started wanting to be published and wanting to get more involved. Although it wasn't until my 40s, early 40s, that I graduated with my master's degree in English literature, because I felt that was another step to becoming a serious writer, having that sheepskin, as we say about that, and also it just gave me a broader base of knowledge. But then again, I didn't get the master's in poetry or MFA. It was just in American
Right.
in English literature. But through that, your writing skills are improved, and you are exposed to a lot of things that helps you as a writer.
Do you feel like you needed that?
I think I
Sixteen?
did. I think, well, number one, I needed someone, someone on the Harvard. When someone on the Harvard faculty said you're a good writer and you wrote this really good thesis, it gives you a lot of confidence. It's one thing your mother's telling you you're a good writer. It's another thing when Ruth Weiss, for instance, who was a major Yiddish literature scholar, working with who was the guy, Irving Howe.
Mhm.
And all those stuff, who said, this is a good piece of work, and gave me an A minus or whatever it was.
Right.
So and then you feel like you're a writer, and then you go through all this, writing the thesis and writing these critical papers and doing deep analysis, which is against my nature. I'm a very impressionistic writer, but I did this exercise for years. It took me, because I was working full time, in McLean Hospital, all the while doing this. So it took me a while to get the degree. But it was marvelous discipline and marvelous exposure.
Right.
This was from the Harvard Extension School. I got my master's, and anyone who they now have a creative writing program, but I would recommend anyone to go through that.
I want to mention, just before we get too far afield, that Doug has a book out now, a book of his interviews done mostly on this show, from the Paris of New England, and that's available on Lulu.
It was actually published by my press, but it's printed on Lulu, and it was edited by folks from the press and all that, like many of our books.
And you're talking about Ibbotson Press,
Right,
which
Ibbotson
is
Press. Yeah.
right, which is a Somerville-based
Right.
publisher.
Right. IbbotsonPress.com, IBBTSONPRESS.com. The book itself has many of the interviews I've conducted here
Mhm.
and many of the people I've interviewed here, and it's been a hell of a lot of people. If you go to my website, over 6 years, and I won the first Producer of the Year award was presented by Wendy Blum here at the annual meeting, which I was very pleased with. Put her picture in my book,
Uh-huh.
and Bill, I forget Bill's last name, but Bill's producer here also has worked with him, and so many of the interviews that I did were here, you know,
Mhm.
and best thing I ever did was come to the SCAT, where I have, as you know, I'm technically challenged, so I was just really nervous about coming,
Right.
but I came here and, you know, basically, they spoon-feed me. They're
Mhm.
very good,
Right.
and they're very tolerant, and this has opened up a whole new world for
Right.
me, doing these interviews, and people are very anxious to come on the show, even, you know, very accomplished writers to the novice.
Oh, I was excited about being
There you
on the
go.
show. And I also found the book to be fascinating. Anybody that's interested in how the creative mind works or what the creative process is like will enjoy this book. It's very accessible. One of the things,
Which book is that?
same one
Oh,
we're talking about.
Okay, all right, okay.
But one of the things that I like about your poetry is that it seems very accessible.
Yeah, it is accessible. I hope it's layered and has meaning, or it's just not mundane characters. And but it's you know who you are. You know, I am who I am.
Right, and I think, you know, and we've talked about it. Doug had gotten a harsh review from someone,
Harvard Crimson, as a matter
Right.
of fact.
young lady at the Harvard Crimson, and I don't think she got it. I just don't think she really knew
Right.
what you were doing or related to it,
Yeah,
which is, you know, that's one of the dangers with criticism.
right.
Um, as I told you earlier, I kind of immersed myself in Doug Holder poetry today. And I came away thinking about how the thing that makes your mundane characters kind of interesting is that you don't sort of lay them so that they're standing square on their feet and you know exactly where they stand. There's a way in which they're always a little bit off balance. They're caught in a moment. It strikes me. And the moment is what seems to interest you. For my, you know, that lady that sat on the toilet for 2 years, you know, her whole life
It was
story.
a long moment.
It was a long moment. But there are these moments that seem to, you know, you capture something that visually speaks to you in the moment.
Yeah, someone told me I was doing a reading in Cambridge, Pierre Menard Gallery. I think you've read there. Have you read there?
I haven't read that, but I was there.
And she said, you know, your books remind me of Spoon River Anthology, which was written by Edgar Lee Masters, and it took these little portraits of townsfolks and, you know, just regular folks. And I guess she was right. And then I wrote a book based on that, The Man in the Booth in the Midtown Tunnel, about the various characters I've met over the years. So yeah, I do like portraits. I've always, like Twilight Zone, I always love that, you know, have, if you will, Mr., you know, and there's the neon sign, and there's this guy, it's a
Right,
character study.
right.
And to me, Patty Chayefsky, remember him?
Of course,
Yeah,
of course.
right from the Bronx. And guys
He
like
wrote
that.
Marty.
Yeah, Marty, yeah. What do you want to do tonight? And
I don't know, Benji, what do you want to do?
and those things interest me. People, you know, Requiem for a Heavyweight, things like that. These intense character studies. Someone, you know, silhouetted in, you know, night. I mean, that's always been my thing. I used to say to my father when we went past the Man in the Booth in Midtown Tunnel, if you remember, there was a guy in a booth in the middle of this tunnel. I went in there and I said, Dad, what do you think about that guy? Do you think he has any friends or wives? How the hell do I know? You know, and most people don't think about those people. There's a big invisible.
Right.
You know, we're all invisible to one extent or the other. I mean,
Right,
you know,
right.
and
Seeing going 55 miles an
yeah,
hour.
especially in
Right.
a lone booth, and you know, I always wondered about these off-key characters. You know, those are the people who have been of interest to me for some reason.
And just so our viewers know, Man in the Booth in the Midtown Tunnel is the name of a book of poems
Right.
featuring that same
From
poem.
from our mutual friend Gloria Mindock Savannah Barbara Press, and she now moved to Union Square area. She's right near me now. And
Great, this is going to become a publishing hub.
Yeah, this is the Paris of New England, as you know. Right?
So now, you've interviewed so many poets and writers through the years at this point, and you've read so much poetry. Can you point to any either poet or type of poetry that you would say you enjoy the most?
I like Philip Larkin. He's, you know, he had a very interesting sense of humor. Like one of his poems was titled "Mom and Dad F You Up," and he's a British poet. Of course, I like, I know it's not fashionable, but Edgar Arlington Robinson, who wrote Mr. Corey,
Richard Cory.
Richard Cory, which
Yeah.
is he did a lot of great character
And
studies.
Old Man Flood.
Yeah,
This is
yeah,
an Old
Men
Man
of Achievy, and
Right.
I liked it. T.S. Eliot, of course, Wasteland and all that stuff. Mark Doty, a contemporary poet, I've interviewed him and I enjoy his poetry a lot. Some of Alpha Michael Weaver's stuff I really like.
Is there a poet out there who reminds you of you?
T.S. Eliot.
Really?